Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us this evening to discuss the importance of fair and well-functioning primary election systems. People's Primary is a group of Rhode Islanders supported by national experts that have come together to research the issues, gather input, and possibly make recommendations on improving our primary system. What we are finding is that under the current system, there's a lack of voter participation and genuine competition. Just for example, in September 2020 primary presidential year, 13% of registered voters voted in the primary. 53% of the General Assembly incumbents were not opposed, and another 14% of Assembly candidates didn't face any serious opposition. Brookings Institute did a study recently, and the headline of the study was that primary elections are the most important elections. So the purpose of today's conference is really to hear your concerns and questions to inform the state as we go forward into looking at primary system and looking at possible recommendations. Before doing so, I want to ask some of our national leaders to help set the framework briefly for our conversation. And we have two. We have Dave Jolly, who is chairman of the Serve America movement and one of our national partners in exploring primary reform. The Serve America movement is a Big Ten organization that has worked for electoral reform in several states, focusing on the values of transparency, accountability, and competitiveness. Prior to coming to SAM, the Serve America movement, Dave served as a congressman from the western part of the state of Florida. The second person that has come to speak is John Updike. John is the president of Open Primaries. He's recognized as the nation's most informed advocate for primary reform. And the mission of the organization he heads, Open Primaries, is to conduct research, host education forums, and educate the public about the primary election system. So let me turn it over to Dave for some comments. Dave?
Sure, Gary, thank you. And to everybody who's taken some time today, thank you. If you're on this call, you're part of a universe that's interested in electoral reform and ultimately as a way to increase competitiveness, accountability, and direct participation by voters. At the Serve America movement, Gary, thank you for that introduction. We actually believe at the Serve America movement, in full disclosure, that an additional way to achieve true reform is that America needs more than just two competitive parties, that a multi-party democracy gives voice to the most number of people. And in doing so, our theory of the case is that if there is to be a competitive party, perhaps the way we do it is by coalescing around shared values and shared principles, as opposed to insisting on shared dogma and ideology. That there is a wide swath of the American people who really just want to see a government that works for the most number of people, delivers results on our most pressing challenges, healthcare, education, and so forth. What I would tell you is, if you go down that lane that the Serve America movement has, you quickly realize that first, before we really see a competitive multi-party democracy, whether you support one or not, the precedent to that is fundamental electoral reform. Understand that through a series of closed primaries, big money, gerrymandering, whatever those issues are that create a rigged system, the whole premise of unrigging it is to greater empower voters and to ensure that on election day, the most number of voters can meet the most number of candidates, and the franchise of the voter can tilt towards that candidate that expresses the position that best represents the most number of people. It's a fundamental premise. John Updike and I have gotten to know each other through his work with the Open Primaries group, and you are going to have an opportunity to visit with one of the real experts on this singular electoral reform issue. And what I would suggest you begin to think about in the space of open primaries, but also all of the other ways that our current system has been built up. Many of today's systems were built up not out of malice. They're used today out of self-interest of the two major parties. But if you think about how primaries are done, perhaps they used to be conventions. Of course, you can make a strong case that only members of one party should be able to influence the other. The problem is that that one element has become part of a broader system that continues to ensure that only the most ardent partisans have the opportunity to influence who our candidates are that we see in November. And if you're a registered no party affiliate like myself, you only get to see two choices then in November. What John and his organization continue to work to is to opening up that franchise to as many voters as possible and ultimately incentivize, not punish, but incentivize better behaviors from candidates to give voice to more number of people. I'll close with this, not to put too fine a point on it, but the US is an outlier in having a two-party system. Most countries, Western countries, have a multi-party system. No system is perfect, but what you do see in those other systems is the ability for the people to influence and move their government towards the passions of the time, not to move their party towards the passions. And ultimately, what we are risking, if this goes on for decades upon decades, is a fundamental change to the very democracy upon which the country was founded. If our franchise gets further removed from us, if we are less and less able to hold accountable candidates and elected officials, then this will be a government by those doing the governing, not a government by the people. And Gary, I thank you for what you're doing in Rhode Island. The Serve America movement is excited to have an opportunity to work with you in Rhode Island, and in particular on this most important issue of people's primary, and advocated and informed by much of the great work over at the Open Primaries Coalition. So with that, John, I'd hand it to you to take us from here.
Sure, thank you. It's great to be here with you, Gary, and all of you. And hello, Rhode Island. I'm up here in New Jersey. And Gary asked me to share just a very brief kind of national picture of what the conversation and what the action looks like all over the country. And I want to let all of you know, you are not alone. People are looking at how we do primaries from Oregon to Florida. It's getting national attention and local attention, and people are experimenting with different approaches with how to deal with, I think David put it very well, the current system probably worked pretty well 50 years ago, 70 years ago, but given the dynamics and the demographics in America today, it's really out of date. I think there's three main, from where I sit, three main changes, developments that are really driving the conversation about restructuring how we do primary elections. The first is the rise of independent voters. This is now the largest and fastest growing set of voters in the country. It's happening in red states, blue states, and purple states. Americans are increasingly deciding that they don't want to join either of the major parties. And by 2030, independents are on track to be the largest or second largest group of voters in every state that registers voters by party. The second dynamic is that the November election, in 70, 80, up to 90% of the country, depending on how you parse it and which election year, the November election is non-competitive. In areas of the country that are controlled by the Democrats or the Republicans, after the primary, the general election is an afterthought. In fact, 40% of state legislators in 2020 ran unopposed. That's the level of, or rather the lack of competition that's taking place in the general election all over the country. And the third thing, is that legislators themselves are increasingly complaining that they're unable to enter into negotiations with the other side, to join legislation, to put their name on a bill that's been sponsored by someone from outside their party, for fear of being punished in a small turnout partisan primary. And that's preventing meaningful innovation in so many states across the country on a whole range of issues. So in the last decade or so, people have been experimenting with new forms of primaries that attempt to solve all three of these problems. And I'll just run through them briefly, and then we can get into details later. In Colorado, what they did was they allowed independent voters to simply vote in a party primary, and which you already have in Rhode Island. And it might not seem like a big deal, but prior to 2016, independents were shut out completely. And what they do in Colorado, which has really worked well, is not only can independents vote in either the Democratic primary or the Republican primary, but they mail the ballots to every voter, and they get to choose which one they want to vote in from the privacy of their home. This has seen voter turnout skyrocket. Colorado now has the second highest turnout in the country, and more people are registering independent. It's over 45% now in Colorado. In Alaska, they just in 2020 enacted a system called Final Four. They eliminated the Democratic primary and the Republican primary. There's now just a people's primary, a public primary. Every voter gets to participate. Every candidate is on the ballot. And the four most popular candidates, regardless of party, go from the primary to the general election. And in the general election, they use something called ranked choice voting to determine the ultimate winner. That's the Alaska model. In California, in Nebraska, and in Washington state, they've done something called top two. In the top two system, there is no more Democratic primary or Republican primary. There is a people's primary. And the two most popular candidates, regardless of party, advance to the November election for a head-to-head election, where they don't use ranked choice voting in the general election. And finally, in Louisiana, what they've done is eliminate primaries altogether. They have one election. It's in November, and all the candidates are on the ballot, and the voters choose for them. And if someone doesn't get 50%, they get 47.8%, there is a runoff election in December. Oh, and Maine, by the way, just last week passed partisan open primaries. They now allow the 350,000 independent voters to choose a Democratic ballot or a Republican ballot. Each of these systems has trade-offs, strengths and weaknesses. A lot of it also is the Alaska system has not yet been tested in real time. They're going to have an election in June that uses this system for the first time. There's still a lot of scholarship and research being done, but these are some of the different models that activists around the country and lawmakers are beginning to implement in their state. And I think over the next decade, we're going to see a lot of interesting results from these different systems. So that's a quick national overview. Let me turn it back over to you, Gary.
Yeah, thanks, John. Before I get going, I look quickly at the screen and I want to recognize that Senator Sam Zuria has joined us. And anytime I have a conversation with Sam, I feel a lot smarter as a result of it. He's truly one of our more thoughtful elected officials in the state. We're really pleased that you're with us, Sam. The Hassenfeld Institute was curious as to what people in Rhode Island understood about primary system here and what their understanding and their opinions were on various options. So Joe Fleming, who has done polling for us for a decade and probably does most of the political polling in the state, conducted a poll for us. It was a random sample of 400 registered voters. It was conducted between May 7th and May 10th of this year, so it's really fresh off the presses. It's only a couple of weeks old, and it had a margin error of plus or minus of 4.8%. And I just want to briefly go through some of the highlighted findings in this poll. In the first slide, just try to catch up with you. We asked the question, are you aware of the rules for voting in a Rhode Island primary? And I was surprised, 80% of the people said that they were. And as you know, in our system, if you're unaffiliated, you can choose to vote in either the Democrat or Republican primary. If you're a member of a primary, it's more difficult to switch parties. But based on this polling, a majority, 4/5, said they were aware of primary voting in Rhode Island, which is interesting because it doesn't square with the participation rates that we've monitored for the last 2 decades. Second slide asked the question, do you favor open primaries? And open primaries, where a voter just on their own identification can vote in either the Democrat or Republican primary. And it's interesting that about 57% favored the open primary of all voters, compared to 32% that wanted to keep it the way it was. It was almost 2 to 1. And you see that trend is most highlighted if you look at the last set of bars among independent voters, where 2/3 felt they supported an open primary system. But the difference between Democrats and Republicans wasn't that much different. It was pretty much close to the margin of error in terms of support for an open primary system. So I think the takeaway, there is that open primaries, would be well received based on this survey. The second issue was single primary, where all the candidates would run in one primary, be they Democrat or Republicans or independents or whatever, and the top 2 vote getters would advance to the general election, a single primary. And the results were uniform, whether a person says they were Democrat or Republican or independent. 59%, almost 60% favored the single primary system, but so did 54% of Democrats, 63% of Republicans, 61% of independents. So statistically, across the board, there seemed to be support on our survey for a single primary. The next poll, next question rather, asked, would you support a candidate having received a majority, 50% plus 1, as opposed to a plurality of votes? And here it was pretty mixed. All voters, 43-39, but that was well within the margin of error. And as you can see, the results didn't vary very much by political party affiliation. So in terms of majority, favoring a majority of votes to win, it was a slight majority favored a majority, but certainly not very wide margins and certainly within the margin of error. The final question that I want to share tonight dealt with ranked choice voting. And on the question of ranked choice voting, which you'll understand, you rank your choices and the candidate with the fewest votes is struck out. His votes, second place votes are redistributed. Again, within the margin of error, but there wasn't broad support for ranked choice voting in the state. If you look at the poll that we conducted, 36% favored ranked choice, 47% said they opposed it. What I find interesting is that the Republicans, which are the smallest party in our state, of the 2 major parties, 54%, a majority of Republicans, were opposed to ranked choice voting, whereas among Democrats, it was 41 in favor, 45 against. Again, pretty even in the margin of error. So what the data showed is that people had, understood the system. They had, definite, viewpoints of what kinds of reforms they would favor. And I think the work going forward now is to get input from you and from others and do our research and try to get what behind the numbers and what the political and the economic impacts would be of change. And with that, let me throw it over to Dave Preston, who is the president of New Harbor Group, to facilitate the conversation going forward. David?
So thanks, Dave and John and Gary. A lot to chew on here. Just to get the ball rolling, if anybody has any questions or comments, if you could just raise your hand. And how you do that is you go down to the bottom of your screen where it says reactions. You click on reactions and you'll see raise hand there. And if you just click on raise hand, I will see the hand raised in the participants list, and I will call on you and Justin will unmute you. I'll have a couple of minutes to ask you a question or make your comments. You can also see if my instructions were inadequate. You can see that Justin has put in you can see that Justin has put in the instructions for raise hand in the chat area. So I did see that we do have two raised hands. And so if we just go to Guy Dufall, first Guy.
Unmute yourself, Guy.
Thanks, Dave. It's probably heresy for me to be on this call because I'm the former Democratic state chairman in Rhode Island, and having Democratic primaries dominating the waves, it would seem somewhat unusual that I would be supportive of change to the primary system. But I have seen in my 45 years of this system really a degradation of the turnout through the primary process, and a lot more races just being unopposed in general. So I really think we need to do something to shake up this system, get more people involved. And I think we've got a prime example sitting in front of us right now. We have a five-way Democratic primary for governor. As little as 31% could win that race, which means out of 650,000 registered voters, as little as 35,000 people could determine the next governor, considering the Republican candidate was not a Rhode Island resident as of January. So her odds are long of being able to succeed. So we really could be, electing the next governor of the state of Rhode Island with 35,000 votes. And I just think that puts us in a real, kind of a crazy situation that demands some attention. So I'm a real firm advocate of the open primary system. I personally favor everybody getting in the open primary and then the top two advancing, so that we do get into the 50+1 situation. And I think there'll be complaints, from all sides and everybody. I know Democrats probably like it the way it is because they win about 85% of the races in Rhode Island. The Republicans won't like it because every other decade they get to the finals in a Republican, and the Democratic bashing in the primary allows them to elect a Republican governor, once a decade. But at the end of the day, we're just not serving the people of Rhode Island in the best fashion, in my humble opinion. So I'd like to just weigh in on the fact that I think the way we can get more people involved in the process and energize the process and get more people involved in the primary process is moving to this type of system where everybody jumps into the primary, whether they be independents, cool moose, Democrat, Republican, and let the top two, if you're in Situate and it's a state rep race, it's going to be two Republicans most likely for the beginning. And if you're in Providence, Pawtucket, or one of the urban areas, it's probably going to be two Democrats. But at the end of the day, in November, you're getting your choice of, I think, the two best moving forward versus what we have now, which is a slate of nobody against about 60% of the field. So I'm a strong advocate of it. And I think we need to really just take a good, hard, long look at it. Thank you.
Hey, David, can I jump in with a response? Because Guy, your comment there actually hits on something very important that I think we should take home a little bit. Open primaries, a lot of these electoral reforms, but particularly open primaries, is one of those that you can quickly get down the legal construct of, well, is that fair to Republicans or Democrats or so forth? And that's true. Every one of these electoral reforms can be picked apart or supported with some legal analysis or analytical approach. But you just took a very different approach. And I think each one of us need to decide what our approach is. You basically have taken the approach that the most important thing we can do is open up the ballot to as many voters and candidates as possible. That actually what we really need to do to empower our democracy is expand the franchise to as many people as possible. And I think that's an inflection point for us, right? Is that our primary goal here, is to get greater participation in the most number of voters and candidates out there? And I think I would make the argument it is. And then on the legal side, I think there are pros and cons to make arguments on open primaries or closed, and John deals with those all day long. But I don't think we should overlook the impact of what you just said. As a former Democratic chair, that the ill that you see that needs fixed is that we don't have enough people participating. And that's the greatest need we have out there.
Let me jump in and just pick up on what David said. I attended a meeting recently of Latino and African-American voters, and they went as far in several in the meeting to define the current primary system as voter suppression. So it's just the whole concept of opening up and making it easier for people is very, I think, important.
Great, thanks, guys. Let's go to Steve Barrett. Steve has his hand up. Steve, go ahead.
Thank you, David. Here in New Jersey, we have a similar primary system to the one that was described, and that's what attracted me when I saw the link on the website. Our primaries work very similar to yours. And an operative told one of our people once that, quote, he could live with ranked choice voting because we think we can still win under ranked choice voting, but open primaries is a non-starter. So that begs the question, and I'm a rookie. I don't see how we can expect reasonably that elected officials are going to undo this path of entitlement to public office. The most glaring example being Ohio, where they say that the legislators in Ohio have not run in a competitive election in 12 years due to gerrymandering and various manipulations. The parties benefit from this closed primary system in ways that go well beyond open primaries. But how does the group think we're ever going to push this through a partisan legislature in any state?
We just passed this in Maine. The governor just signed the bill last week, and it took 5 years. And at the end of the day, we got 75% of the legislators to come on board. And there were a couple things about it that I think are worth sharing. One, we built a groundswell of public support, and that is crucial. That's, letters to the editor, getting editorial endorsements, getting organizations like the League of Women Voters to come on board and share it with their supporters. And we built a true people's movement in the state over many years. And our legislative sponsors played a very crucial role in making sure that the bill was not perceived as a Democratic bill. They brought in their Republican colleagues from day one in shaping this and discussing this. So the end product was something that everybody felt like they had participated in creating. And we had a great sponsor, Senator Chloe Maxman. Steve, you raise the difficulty of this, and I will not lie and say getting any reform through a legislature is difficult for the reasons that you point out. But we're living in, Guy is not the only person talking about degradation of democracy. People are paying attention to this, and I think our challenge is how to translate that into effective legislative campaigns. But I don't think it's impossible.
Well, I'm also from New Jersey, so I know what I know about our political process, and so we're pushing also for citizen initiative and referendum because I think people should be, I mean, the politicians, the parties are too involved in making the rules, and they should be they should be maybe pushed back away a little bit. They should have the same right at that table that the Libertarian Party and the Green Party and those other parties have. And it should be the people that make the rules for elections. And I think then things would be, and redistricting, and things would get more fair as a result. But thank you. I appreciate the answer.
If you raise an interesting point, though, it is a function of state law. So advances in each state look very differently. And maybe David, Gary, or Sam, if someone wants to just give a quick primer on Rhode Island, because you also have a convention option there that's the real long stretch, right?
Yeah, I see it a little bit differently, because Steve asked the question, how do you make change? And no one's naive enough to think that you can take politics out of politics. You can't. It's a political system, and that's fine. But I've worked around several legislatures, and what I have found is that the people in leadership don't get as much credit as they sometimes deserve. And what they're finding right now is that they want to reach compromise. They want to govern. They want to stay in their leadership positions. They want to show accomplishment. And it's because the parties are becoming so factionalized, it's getting more and more difficult to do it. So when Guy speaks as a former Democratic chairman, and Guy and I go back to the beginning together, I see a definite attitude, and it's a lot of education that's going to be required, but a frustration on the part of leaders who one may agree or disagree with their policies, but who want to get things done, want to compromise, bring things to the table. And what's holding them back are the factions in their own party, not necessarily the opposition. And so that's a dynamic that doesn't exist. And it's a dynamic that through the SAM movement and through open primaries and others, we can learn and figure out how to capitalize on this different environment. I think there's such frustration.
Great. Does anybody else have their hand up or have any questions or comments? Ralph, I see your hand there. So Ralph Coppola.
Thanks, Dave. A couple questions. One is, I'm still concerned about mail-in ballots. Apparently it didn't work in France 20 years ago or 30 years ago, whatever it was. So I don't know why we think it's going to work here unless we really tighten them up. But when you're looking at open primaries, are they affiliated in some states, unaffiliated, or are they all different? Because I think the open primary, of all the systems I've known of, kind of studied, the ranking system is probably the worst one out there because it takes forever to figure out who won the election. They went through that in New York City with the mayor. That was like a kind of a nightmare. And I've seen it. A couple other states had those issues. It seems like the open primaries probably is the best of them all. But again, when you got a state like ours, it's heavily Democratic. Are we going to? What are we going to? If everybody's running and they're all Democrats, then we're back to where we are now. So have we really changed anything at that point? So, I mean, that's what we got now. Everybody, but the only difference is the top two are going to run against each other. I mean, that's the only thing that will accomplish further on from that perspective. So you will get a second choice of who's going to be. But I mean, ultimately, it's still, again, there's still 4 people running or 5 people running for the Democratic governorship and the Democratic primary for the governor. And there's 1 person running on the other end that's, again, is, a new Rhode Islander. So you're basically back to whoever wins the primary will ultimately, for the most part, is high probability they will win the general election. Let's take that one step further. Let's do it. If we were to do this and say, okay, we're going to do this on an open primary. The only difference is the top 2 people will be facing each other in the end. That thing. So you're back to the same thing. You got the top 2 people facing each other in the primary right now, and whoever wins wins. And now then you're going to have the top 2 people. The only difference is, I guess, you're going to have the voters only voting for 2 people instead of voting for 5 people. So you'll see where those other votes would have gone. Is that correct? Or where they go, and it just changes that dynamic, I would say.
John, David, to get any input on that or any feedback?
I mean, one quick thought is that, you raise very valid concerns, Ralph, and I'd be the first one to say that reforming the system is not like turning on a light switch. It doesn't transform the political outcomes and the environment overnight. One thing they've seen in California that was very surprising and very noticeable, in a lot of these districts that are very liberal, where they tend to get two Democrats facing off each other in November, what they found is that Democrats started changing how they were campaigning because they recognized that the likelihood was that they would end up against another Democrat in the fall. And they had to figure out, how am I going to distinguish myself as a Democrat? Well, one of the ways they answered that question was by starting their campaign and starting to appeal to independents and Republicans from day one. So you're right, you end up with a choice of two Democrats. Is that an ideal situation? Probably not. We'd like to have more choices and more competition, but you start getting candidates that have built campaigns around creating consensus, creating some new types of coalitions that go beyond the party base. So even though California is a supermajority, like Rhode Island, a supermajority Democratic state, the types of Democrats that are being successful in that system are Democrats that have the capacity to reach beyond the party base. And that's impacting on the legislative process in some very positive ways. But is it a cure-all to all problems in politics? Absolutely not.
John, I just to butt in, I would also observe that I read a report or a comment about California, and over the last 10 years, the confidence in government has gone up very highly, much more than to a great degree as a result.
Yeah,
Yeah,
good.
Voter satisfaction of the legislature went from 9% to over 50% in a decade.
Well,
Good to know.
to get to Ralph's point, a lot of things we don't know. But the way we endorse candidates now, how will the endorsement process be affected by maintaining the current system versus a single primary? What role would leadership play, in that process? The way we endorse candidates, does it encourage or discourage other people to get involved? I think the point made that, and this is why we wanted input, and we're still studying this, is will you get candidates to run who are interested in building consensus? Can they build consensus from the current primary system? Those are questions. I'm not trying to answer those questions, but that's the challenge, just to try to figure that out.
Yeah. Next, we got Maureen Moakley. If we could unmute Maureen, or Maureen, if you could unmute yourself.
Okay, John, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned that they put in a new system in Maine. I wanted to clarify, did they not already have a ranked choice voting system that they changed? Or is this something different?
The voters of Maine enacted ranked choice voting for general elections
Okay.
back in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
But the legislature tried to repeal it, and then the voters said, no, you can't repeal it, we put it in place.
Mm-hmm.
So they've had ranked choice voting since 2016. However, the first round, the primaries, were only open to Democratic and Republican voters. So this change was simply to allow independents to participate in the first round. But it didn't change the ranked choice voting system in the general election.
Okay, thank you. My second question is for Gary. Gary, I didn't understand what you were referring to when you said that an open system would make the legislature be more cooperative, that they'd be more inclined to consensus. Would you explain that to me?
Yeah, I try to, and it's a subjective, I had a subjective response. Currently, whether it's Democrat with the extreme progressives or Republicans with the Trumpies, the extreme right, and I think they have a disproportionate impact on how effective leaders can be. The job of a legislative leader, a governor, political leader, is to try to bring people together, try to solve problems, try to develop consensus. And the current primary system seems in some ways to make it easier for the extremes to get involved, especially in small districts that we have here and what's involved. So what I meant to say by that, and I hope this is a clear answer, is that it could result in more candidates running who are moderate, who try to build coalitions, try to make concessions, and that puts leadership in a position potentially of producing better for the people. I don't know if that answers your question, Maureen. That's what I was
Well,
trying to say.
I'm just trying to tease out that because, we need parties at the legislature. They're organizing principles.
Yeah.
And that's critical. And so we can't, we don't want a multi-party. I don't think we want a multi-party system. I think we want an organizing principle. And so I see what you're saying about closing out sort of the extremes of the right and the left, I think. But I wonder if that will happen.
Maureen, I would offer a perspective, Gary, and jump in because I do think this is critical. In the electoral reform space, we quickly find ourselves into a role of constructive criticism, and we kind of demonize incumbency and we say everything that's wrong about it. I actually think this is a good opportunity to flip the script and talk about what incentives do we want in front of our incumbents? What incentives do we want in front of our candidates? And I can tell you, having served in Congress in one of the handful of 50-50 districts, I was a Republican at the time, but President Obama had won it twice. The most important race I had to get through was my primary. And so for 18 months, what incentivized my voting record was whether or not I would get through my primary. If I was otherwise incentivized by what best reflects where the consensus in my community is, now electoral reform has achieved behavioral reforms within legislatures. But I never got to operate in that environment, right? I would love to operate in a 50-50 district. I would love to operate in an open primary environment where I knew there was electoral reward, there were additional constituencies that if I gave voice to them, now we're building a coalition. I agree with your fundamental premise on parties. You need an organizing presence, but in a closed primary system that is further enhanced by gerrymandering and further enhanced by campaign finance rules that favor the two major parties, I would suggest the incentive structure is all wrong. And perhaps the greatest contribution of electoral reform in open primaries is to incentivize behaviors that represent a broader part of a voting population than currently has voice.
Good point, David. Anybody else have any question or comments? We got a few minutes left for some folks to jump in. Guy, if you want to jump in, and then Ralph.
Yeah, just to follow up to Ralph's and to give an example. I'm not necessarily saying this is the case in this particular election, but the whole concept, let's look at the Democratic primary for governor, and I'll go back to that as an example. In our state, unions have a tremendous say within the primary process. There are 60,000 union members. They vote about 2/3 of their members. So they have about 40,000 people, and they all show up in the Democratic primary. So when you have 120,000 people voting and 40,000 of them coming out of the labor movement, and they have a fair-haired candidate, that candidate most likely is going to win that primary. So let's take the example we have in front of us with the 5 now. Let's say the incumbent has full labor support. With 40,000 votes, he wins the governorship right now, ostensibly will win the governorship. If you had a two-way runoff, and let's say it's the incumbent McKee versus Nellie Gorbea, the Secretary of State, you then in November, and I think this goes to Ralph's issue of this is a dramatic change. Now 330,000 people are determining who the next governor of Rhode Island is. And not just the power of one special interest segment. And it doesn't have to be unions, it could be any special interest, which goes to Maureen and Gary's point. Sometimes the extremes of the parties quote unquote steal primaries. They go in these low turnout races, particularly in the General Assembly. You go into Providence, you can win a primary with 1,200 votes, 1,100 votes. So I think the idea of getting to the two-person runoff kind of takes away a lot of the power of some of these special interest groups, and having some of these races be tremendously slanted towards one way or another. And by the way, I'm speaking against myself. I'm in the political consulting business now. People pay me for these strategies to be able to tell you this stuff. But, you know, at 70, I guess I can get away with it. You know, that can happen in this election. If all the unions got behind one of those candidates, they were all behind Nellie. Nellie would be the next governor of the state of Rhode Island with 38,000 votes. And we're going to have 330,000 people on average voting in November versus 120,000 on average in a Democratic primary. So I think there's a lot to be said for this, you know, this process and opening it up and getting more people involved and having the decision-making process wider, because I respectfully suggest if it was, you know, Nellie versus McKee in our present environment, and my apologies to the out-of-state people, but that's the incumbent and the Secretary of State running against each other, might be a very dramatic difference in the general election.
Good
But you
point,
can-
Gary.
I'm sorry.
Quick question, when you go to open primaries, how much does it increase the voter turnout for the primaries in total? Because that's a big difference too, because if you got 100,000 people voting in the primary and I get 200,000 people that vote in the primary, because they don't have to pick a primary, especially with the independents, because they don't really have to pick a side they have to go vote on, so they just kind of wait until afterwards. Anybody see the stats on how many more people turn out in an open primary state versus when it wasn't open?
I can answer that. First of all, you know, as everybody knows, turnout is not kind of a binary function. There's a lot of different impacts on it. The Bipartisan Policy Center did a study. The highest turnout is in these you know, open primaries where there's a single primary. Then the open primary where you have to pick a Democratic or Republican ballot is the second highest, and then closed primaries are the third highest. Colorado has seen a bump by combining an open primary with mail-at-home voting, and the numbers in their primary have surged. They've doubled turnout in the primaries between 2016 and 2020. California, Washington, Nebraska, they see consistently high turnout, but it also varies district to district. A lot of times, if there's a popular incumbent, turnout will go down. When there's an open seat, turnout will go up. So general trend is you increase participation in both the primary and the general, but it's not uniform in every single district.
And it's all adding up, because in the end, like I was saying, that, you know, you're going to have 300 and something thousand people voting for the two top candidates at one of the primaries, an open primary, and I think that kind of says something in itself.
Okay. Does anybody else have any questions or comments? I see Judge Flanders, get your hand up.
Yes, just want to obtain a clarification. When we talk about open primaries, I'm hearing two different types. One type is where you allow independent voters to participate in either a Republican or a Democratic primary, and that's open in that sense. But then there's the open primary where it's not a partisan primary anymore. Anybody can choose to and participate in that primary. So I think it's important that we somehow come up with some language that will differentiate between those two very different types of, quote, open primaries. Rhode Island has an open primary in the sense that we allow non-party people who aren't registered as a Democrat or Republican to participate in party primaries. But we don't have an open primary right now where anybody can run in that primary and vote in those primaries. So I think we need to distinguish between those two, because it's very confusing right now when we talk about open primaries in either this state or other states, we need to be more precise, I think.
Yeah, I would
You know-
agree. And I think from a definition perspective, we have in Rhode Island a semi-open primary, which means the partisan and the unaffiliateds can vote in the partisan primary. So Democrats unaffiliated in the Democrats, Republicans unaffiliated in the Republicans. So that's semi-open. An open primary is anybody who shows up can vote in any primary they want, which we used to have in Rhode Island prior to 1976. So what it is that we're going to call the jungle primary or the blanket primary or the people's primary or whatever it is that we call the thing where everyone is in the arena together, we'll come up with something at some point. But that's an excellent point. So right now in Rhode Island, just to restate, we have a semi-open primary.
Sorry, David.
An open primary is what we used to have prior to 1976.
What we did in our research, Bob, is we referred to the open primary as you described it, and the other type of primary we called a single primary. And people seem to understand that distinction as we were doing our polling and opinion research. But we have to refine that. But we've been used single primary and open primary, and that was the dichotomy.
One other follow-up question, interested in Guy Default's comment on this. He's made the point that he thinks going to open primaries or single primaries would have the effect of diminishing special interests effect on the ultimate elections. I'm wondering whether you think the single primary, open primary would diminish the effect of parties in Rhode Island, or weaken parties, or be perceived to weaken parties' influence.
I think it actually, Judge, I think it actually would strengthen the parties, because now the parties are going to have to compete at two different levels, which is they're going to have to put their best foot forward in the initial open primary process. Right now, I think they mail it in, quite frankly, in some of these primaries. And so I think this is an opportunity for the parties to really sharpen their message and get a little bit better at running both sides. And I'll tell you, I think it's even better for the Republican Party. And I know a lot of people think that because basically, we have 85% of the seats in Rhode Island, that it would hurt Republicans. But as we all know, the definition of insanity, when you're at 15%, you got to do something different. I think this is an opportunity for Republicans to, I bet you would have gotten more Republicans interested in the gubernatorial race being able to steal a first or second spot when you have 5 Democrats battling it out with a Republican in that race. I can almost guarantee the Republican gets into one of those 2 spots, and they get their name recognition out earlier, which is one of the problems for the party now, because you really have a tremendous challenge on your hand with the mid-September primary process in 7 weeks, having to be able to run a race. And the only, I say this with loving care for the Republicans, Bob, but you only win when the Democrats kill each other. That's the only time you ever win, is when we beat each other up on my side. If we had a primary process in May or June, which I would advocate, or even March, which I would advocate, which most states do, it would be a little bit different. But you've got 7 weeks. And I think for like in a General Assembly race, it's extraordinarily difficult to get that message out in only 7 weeks when you're against somebody who's been running in a primary since, the filing deadline in the 3rd week in June. So I think it would be helpful overall to both parties, because I think it would make them perform better.
Well, the data shows, which I was surprised, that Republicans are the strongest supporters of a single primary. 63% of Republicans said they would support a single primary compared to 54% of Democrats. And
no elected Republicans are saying that, though.
There's not that many elected Republicans. We'll have to find some.
So let's go to John Hanley, and then let's go back over to Maureen. So John, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is, could you address the importance of mail ballots to all registered voters as part of the process, drive the participation up? Thank you very much.
Okay. John, David, it's a little bit, it's not exactly a bullseye of what we're talking about today, but do either one of you want to handle that?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I'm not an expert on this. I know from experience in Oregon and Colorado, one of the things that mail-in, all mail-in voting, meaning there are no polling places. Everybody just votes from the kitchen table.
Mhm.
It's had two effects that are interesting. One, you just get higher turnout. People get a ballot, they get 2 weeks to sit around, talk about it, mail it in. In the primary, it's particularly effective because people can choose in the privacy of their home, do they want to vote in the Democratic primary or the Republican primary? And that privacy issue is something that is becoming increasingly relevant. I just got a report from an activist in Texas. They just had their primary. I'm sorry, this is from last year, who said that there were dozens of voters who came into the polling place during the primary, and they were asked by the greeter, are you voting in the Democratic primary or the Republican primary? And there were a lot of people that felt very uncomfortable saying that out loud in public, and they left. They wouldn't vote. Because we live in times in which, there's a lot of name calling and there's a lot of stigma. And if you're a Democrat living in a Republican area, maybe you don't want people to know that. And if you're a Republican living in Providence, maybe you don't want people to know that. And so the mail-in voting has been helpful in terms of increasing turnout and also increasing privacy.
Good feedback, John. Thanks. All right, so we've got 2 minutes to go, and why don't we have Maureen? You got your hand raised, so go right ahead.
Just one quick, this is like a wild thought, but I think the idea in the general election and statewide races is just super compelling. I'm not so sure it's as compelling for the legislative races. Would we ever consider just putting this in for statewide races? Or is that just too much effort for too little payoff? And the other thing I just wanted to say, with the new regulations about mail ballots here, we're going to get high turnout in the mail.
Yep. Okay. Good input.
Does anybody
Gary,
think that, is that possible?
That's something that we have, now you raised a good point, because one of the issues that we have, before us is to make a recommendation and try to answer the question as to who what offices the primary reform should apply to. And we've kind of, among ourselves, concluded that it doesn't make much sense to have it applied to local races here, because the city charters and town charters and different kinds of offices. But the question of the legislature and the executive is something that we have to think our way through. The concern I would have is not to confuse people by having too many different systems. So
Yeah,
you
that's
really,
a good point. That is a good point.
yeah.
Thank you.
Cool. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Gary. It's 4:59. This was an excellent event, and I'm sure that everybody has a lot to chew on, so that we can come back in June, get together, and figure out what's the best path forward. So Gary, back over to you.
yeah, just very quickly, I really want to thank everybody for joining us, excuse me, this evening. Your comments were, really very helpful. It's like having a giant focus group who just gleaned a lot of information, and our research is currently underway. We're going to further frame the discussion and direction of advocacy over the next few months. We're developing a white paper, which will circulate to everybody and bring everybody back to summarize your input and the work that John and David and others are doing. And once that white paper is finished, we'll send it out and have a conversation again and keep on informing the process. In the meantime, updates will be available through our email newsletter and through social media. We advise you to continue following us. And if anybody wants to be part and really spend a lot of time on this and become part of the exploratory group, just contact me directly and I'll make sure that happens, because we want as many ideas as we can. And we want this to be as participatory process as humanly possible. So follow us. You'll be getting the white paper soon. We'll reconvene the group and see where we are at that point. Again, thank you for your help this afternoon. It was tremendously helpful. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.